Cool. So let's get started then. Welcome everyone, and welcome to our first Fireside Chat by the Q community. It's on how to prevent common automation failures, organized by the Q community. Q community basically aims to build and serve a community of test automation enthusiasts with the prime objective to find and nurture ways to transform test automation to be simpler, more reliable, and sustainable for the real world. In today's fireside chat, we'll talk about testing, test automation, and lots more uh, our way. We will also have a quick fireside chat with Carlos for about 40-45 minutes, and we'll also take in questions from your side. If you have any, feel free to use the Q&A tab, and Carlos will be probably happy to answer them for you, right? So yes, we'll be talking about test automation. We know, we get product feedback considerably faster with test automation. It helps us to, ship our product faster to market. But there's a common phenomenon. We see projects failing, we see frameworks getting scrapped, projects getting restarted. So let's deep dive into all of these today, and let's discuss this topic with our amazing guest today. So I'm your host, Jocelyn Radis, product evangelist at ACCELQ. And with me, we have Carlos Kidman. Carlos is an engineering manager and test architect at Adobe. He's a renowned name in the testing community, founder of QA at Point, creator of Pylenium. Carlos loves to share his knowledge with the community. He's also an instructor at Test Automation University. I hope all of you may have gone through some of his courses on Docker, setting up frameworks with C Sharp. I think they are very insightful. He's also a podcast host at Ministry of Testing, and there's lots more to Carlos Kidman. So let's get to know him better now. Welcome, Carlos.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited, man.
Cool.
Let's do this thing.
Yes. Let's welcome everyone. So welcome all of you. You can use the Q&A tab, put in your questions while I, ask a few questions to Carlos as well. So Carlos, like before we get started into the depth of this topic, just want to know how did you enter into testing and where did the love for test automation, programming come into picture?
Yeah, I mean, so I don't have a degree or any sort of certification or anything. The way I started was by mainly just falling into it. I was a salesman selling cell phones before. And I had a friend say, "Hey, man, you're really good at Magic the Gathering," which is just a game. It's a card game. And I'd go play tournaments and stuff. And he's like, "You're really good at it. I think that analytical side of what you do, I think would be really good for testing." And so I went for an interview and he liked me a lot and they hired me on as a software tester. Um, Before that, I was interested in trying to get into like game development. I thought that'd be really cool to build video games, but I wasn't very good at it. But the nice thing was that I was exposed to a little bit of programming. And so I knew that at least programming existed, right? And I knew that programming, you could automate things or have the computer do things. So when I became a tester and I saw what I was supposed to do, they had hired me to go through an application that had just a bunch of drop downs. So you would select drop downs, you would click generate, and if a report appeared, then that test passed. And I would fill out a spreadsheet and say, "Yep, this URL, disney.com/this thing," it generated a report in green checkmark. If you clicked regenerate and nothing appeared, that was a bug, and I would put an X there. Oh, the nike.com/whatever, it didn't generate, so put a red X. And I had to do that all day, every day, like literally just click a drop down, click generate, click a drop down, click generate, and did that for 8 hours a day for the first week. And so I finished because I wanted to do really well. And after that, he said, "All right, good job. We're going to do it again next week." That's when I learned that was my entire purpose. My entire purpose was to literally click drop downs and click generate and fill out a spreadsheet. And that was software testing to them. And at that time, I didn't know any better. But I knew that, well, isn't there a way that I could automate this? That way I don't have to spend all that time doing it. And so I spent the next week just programming and trying to figure it out. I knew very little code, so it was very ugly. It was very bad. But what took me and another girl 80 hours to do, my program could do in 4. And so even though I sucked at automation, I sucked at programming, I still was able to deliver something that greatly reduced the amount of time that took. And so that's how I got started into it. And once I solved that problem, I was addicted, because at that point I was like, I can do lots of things with code. And then the rest is history now. But so that's kind of how it started for me.
Right. I think that's one good way, to how to leverage and get the true power of automation. Uh, so good story there. As we're talking about the solution that you solved with the first project that you had, like where do you see, like what problems should test automation actually solve? What according to you are some of the problems you think test automation should solve in any organization?
Yeah. And I mean, test automation itself, because when you think of automation engineering, or at least when I think of automation engineering, I see it as a very big umbrella. Uh, Automation engineering will have things like cloud engineering, it will have SRE, it will have monitoring, it will have machine learning. I mean, automation engineering is huge. And just a small piece of that is test automation. But the whole purpose around automation engineering is to accelerate value. You're trying to accelerate the things that product engineers are building, right? So you have a product engineer who's working on the application, working on the product specifically, usually feature work. And then you have automation engineers who are building all of the infrastructure and the automation around that product. And so that's why I say the whole purpose of an automation engineer, the automation engineering discipline, is to accelerate value and give you as many insights and decision-making capabilities as possible. So when it comes to test automation, if you tie test automation to, again, the goal of accelerating value and providing insights and decision-making capabilities, then those are the problems you're trying to solve. If you look at the, let's say, how long it takes to go from a developer committing something to it appearing in production, and you measure that, how long does that take you to do? From developer's laptop to customer's hands in the world, how long does that take? If that is a month, that's really bad, right? If that's a day, that's really bad. It should be minutes. And if it's not minutes, then your automation engineering is probably not very good. Or it could also be that you just don't have very good processes either, or a combination of the two, right? And so in test automation engineering, what you're trying to do is you're trying to make it so then you can get these insights as quickly as possible and get short feedback loops, so then you can quickly iterate and go through from the laptop all the way to customers' hands. You're trying to shorten that amount of time. That's essentially what test automation is trying to do. So any way that you can do that is what you're trying to do, right? Like whether that's with developers doing unit testing, whether that is coming up with doing BDD and doing TDD to accelerate that time, whether it's writing API tests so then you can integrate services more easily and be confident in deploying that service, anything like that. You're just trying to shorten the time it takes from commit to production.
So as we're talking about all these different types of tests, unit tests, API tests, so we know the layer of the test pyramid, right, where we have a structure, where we have unit test, API test, the UI test, and then finally the functional test. So uh, where do you think, when you're designing a test automation strategy for your organization, uh, how do you make sure you're giving equal focus to all of these layers, or where should one focus on when you're deciding a test automation strategy?
So I actually work with the engineering team to determine that, right? I don't go in and prescribe a strategy to a team. If I did that, it wouldn't work. I mean, if the team is not invested in the strategy, then it's not a very good strategy. They're not going to really care, right? It's just, oh, here comes more work for me to do. Instead of, no, well, you need to understand the purpose of what we're trying to do. Now you tell me what you think is the best way to test these things. And I think whenever I've given presentations around things like this, a lot of the questions that I get from the audience would be like, but you're the test architect, so aren't you the one who aren't you supposed to prescribe a strategy? No, actually, I am more of a consultant when I go into teams like that. If they need help setting something up, I'm more than happy to help them out with that. If they've never done contract testing before, it makes sense for me to get it started with them, pair an ensemble program with them and get it going. But eventually my goal is for them to do it by themselves. Otherwise it doesn't scale, right? Everyone at Adobe can't wait for Carlos. Right? That doesn't work. And so you have to work with the team that you're trying to help, and say, let's come up with ideas that we can use so that we can shorten the time frame. Right? The fastest way to shorten the time frame is have 0 tests.
Exactly.
Right? If you have no tests, well, that's really fast. You go just push to production. There you go. You can't be faster than that, right?
Right.
And of course, all the testers right now are going to be like, "What the heck?" Don't do that. But it's true. If you think about it, if you have 0 tests, that's the fastest way for you to go from commit to production. Now, obviously, you need to weigh those trade-offs. So when you tell a developer that, they're going to go, well, I don't think that's a good idea either. And you go, you're right. Why is it not a good idea? And you let them ask those questions. You let them figure things out as well. And then you start coming up with a strategy. Well, if that's the case, if you know why it's a bad idea, what are some solutions to solving this problem? Well, I think we could do better at TDD. Okay, maybe step 1, let's try doing TDD as a team. And maybe I'll start with running a workshop, or I'll pair with them and do testing with them, or maybe I'll do code reviews with them, let them try to figure things out first and then do a code review with them. But the whole point is educating the team in what the risks are of not having tests first, and then filling in the gaps of what can we do. I don't go in there and go, all right, we have a service that we need to test, so we have to do contract testing with Pack. We have to do API testing with PyTest. I don't just do that because it's too much at one time. And so you start small and you try to figure out the purpose behind the testing, the value you want to get from it. And then as a team, you build that strategy together and you start filling in those gaps. And if you do that way, then you are iterating a test strategy. You say V1 of our test strategy is this, and you experiment with that. You run it, you create the CI for it, and you see a bunch of gaps. Oh, well, we would have caught this had we done this. Okay, well, let's focus on this type of testing now. Let's figure that out so we don't run into this again. We can shorten the loop again, right? So that's more so how you should, in my opinion, go with the test strategy. It's not me prescribing, it's the team collaboratively coming up with the strategy.
Right. Exactly. So like we talk about it, like quality is everyone's responsibility, you know. Where can we, actually unite with developers or business analysts? What do you think on this analogy? How can they assist us, when we are doing test automation? What is your outlook there? What would your tips be for us listeners here on what exactly you need to, how you can gel with your developers and what exactly they should be helping you with, or what you need to reach out to them for?
Yeah, and the answer is pair with people, like actually work with them. One of the biggest mistakes that I see testers make is they do everything in isolation. They do everything on their own, and then they complain that I'm seen as a second-class citizen. Oh, I'm seen at the very end of everything. Usually that's because you did that to yourself, or management did that. You may have like test managers or quality managers that are wanting that from you, and you don't have a lot of control over it. Either way, it's usually the tester's fault. The developers will pair with you if you actually are able to deliver valuable things. And so if you yourself don't see testing as valuable, then they're not going to see it as valuable either. And so you need to be able to actually articulate, communicate, visualize the stuff that you're doing. Otherwise, you're convincing no one, right? And so sometimes in interviews for testers, a common question I would ask is like, what do you see the value of testing being? And 9 times out of 10, their answers are really bad, right? The 9 times out of 10, it's not what I'm looking for. It's like, well, we want to find bugs. I'm like, no, if I find bugs, that does this to my time frame. I don't want to find bugs. And they get confused by that. Like, isn't my job to find bugs? I'm like, I don't want you to find bugs. Like in reality, what I want is for us to prevent and mitigate them. I don't want us to go all the way through this pipeline and then here find bugs. Like, that sucks. It's going to happen, but that is not your purpose. If you say that, then you're putting yourself at the very end of the process. So how can we design things better earlier on to make it so we can prevent, mitigate, detect things before we get so far in the pipeline that I now have to go all the way back, right? That feels bad. That's waste of time and money. That's not as valuable to me. So anyway, so what I would say is pair with your programmers, ensemble with your team, and go through exercises with them so that they can be educated on the powerful things that we do in testing. The first time I did example mapping with the team and they saw what we were doing, it light bulbs in all the developers' head, because they're like, this makes it so much easier for us to spec a story because we're actually thinking of real practical examples of what people would do with this feature. Instead, what they used to do before was product manager would create a task or a story, developer would take it, they'd have to estimate it and say, yeah, I mean, it looks like a 3, but you don't really know, it's difficult. You think it's a 3, you're not thinking about testing, you're not thinking about how reliable or secure or whatever it's going to be. You're thinking, how long is it going to take me to build this? You say a 3, you start going into it, and it turns into a 16. Because you're not thinking about all the other holistic things. And so that's what the tester brings in, and you bring in this holistic view, and you say, well, it's a 3 if that's all it is, but I'm thinking of the impact that it's going to have here. It's going to be touching this. We have to tell this other team is going to be affected by our change. We need to work with them as well. And you do this example and impact mapping, and the developers go, holy cow, well, now I know it's not a 3. Thank goodness this tester was here to help me holistically see this thing. And you going through that activity is a very visual way for developers to learn what we do as testers. And they go, I'm so happy that Carlos was there, because now this makes way more sense. I feel much more confident saying that this is too big, we need to break it down further. Or there's more questions. I don't want to start this until I talk to that team first. That kind of stuff, right? Long answer, but
no problems. Always good to hear that. One more common question, we see the fear for testers, there is always a constant fear that they need to learn programming skills, programming languages. So what would be your advice here for someone, stepping into this and, curious to get rid of that fear of stepping into programming?
I mean, you have to practice. I would say testing is a skill set, right? If you want to get better at it, you practice and you do it a lot. Same thing with programming, right? It's a skill set. And so it's something that you just have to practice. And I think one of my favorite ways for people to do it is doing the 100 days of code challenge, where for 100 days, every day, you jump on and you try to code. And you code something. And if you go on Twitter and if you just search for 100 days of code, you'll see so many examples of people that do this, where they'll, for 100 days, pick something that they want to learn and do it. So you might say, I want to do test automation with Python. And a great place to go would be like Test Automation University, and just say every day I'm going to go through that path that they have, and they have like 10, 20 videos you can go through, and just go through that. And for 100 days, commit an hour or two just to work towards that goal. And if you're doing it every single day, I can promise you that after the 100 days, you're going to be pretty solid. You're not going to be the best programmer in the world, of course, but you're going to feel a lot more confident and actually like be able to code things in the world of test automation, actually be able to create automated tests. You'll get into it. So it really is just, you have to jump in and practice. That right there is the bread and butter. Anything else on top of that would be if you can find someone to help be a mentor for you, that's obviously really helpful. If at work you can find developers or other automation engineers to help take things on for you, and hey, could you do code reviews with me? That's also really helpful. So you also want to build a support system around you if you can, but that's not mandatory. That only accelerates your learning and makes it better, but you don't need anyone to really help you there. You can do it on your own if you'd like, but just jump in and practice. And you have communities like the Q community, like Q8 The Point, like Ministry of Testing, Test Automation University. You have all of these communities that are wanting to help you succeed, so you don't have to do it by yourself. So join these communities as well and engage with them.
So, talking about, I know you have a quite of affiliation to Python and so Pylenium. So we'll come to that at some point of time. Uh,
Yeah.
but more or less, right? Like we have a lot of programming languages. We have Java, we have C Sharp, we have Python for that matter, JavaScript. So where do you think testers need to focus on? What should be their prime focus? Which language they should kick off with, or what would you advise them?
Great question. I would say there's a list of priority. So number one is if you're trying to solve something at work, then that is your highest priority right now. What language or languages are they doing there? So if they're doing something with Haskell, some random language, but all your support system, everyone there does Haskell, then you should probably do Haskell. If it's something where everyone's doing Java, then I would do Java. So I think your context should be first priority. If there is no context, in other words, you're just trying to learn something, it's not really for work or a problem you're solving there, you're just wanting to learn something, then my answer changes a little bit. I would go for what you're ultimately wanting to end up in. So if you were to say, like, in 5 years, where do I want to be? Pick your language based off that. It would either be JavaScript or it's going to be Python. They're the two most popular languages in the world. If you want to do things on the front end, JavaScript is your homie. That's the one you should do, right? Whether it's web development, whether you want to do Cypress, whether you want to the company you want to work for is using JavaScript or whatnot. Like, JavaScript's a good language to learn and maybe start there. If you want to move into automation engineering, which is now things like machine learning, SRE, DevOps, kind of cloud infrastructure, I would say Python, because Python is first class citizen in all of these tools. They have Python libraries, Python guides, so many things for Python. I would start with Python. So it more so depends on where you're wanting to go and what problems you're trying to solve. Uh, if you have no idea, Carlos, just tell me one, do Python.
That's a great insight. Even I am a fan of Python, but yeah, it's kind of, I feel the learning curve is also very easy when it comes to Python. So while you're talking about Python, like you have built Pylenium. So what was the inspiration behind building Pylenium? You already had frameworks. What was the thought process that came in your mind when you thought, okay, I need to build something like Pylenium?
The idea came from realizing that every place I went to, like every new job I had, every company that would bring me in for consulting or whatnot, the same problem happened where you'd start and you'd have to build a framework from scratch. Uh, and it was really annoying to have to do, right? It was like, don't you have one already? No, we don't. Okay, I have to make it again. And that's fine. But again, I'm trying to reduce the amount of time it takes for us to do things. And so I was like, well, I would rather have um, something that I could just install and have the framework essentially set up for me. And so that's the whole point of Pylenium, was to make it so then a lot of the stuff that you would build, harnesses, wrapper classes, that kind of thing, it would take you a month or so to build all of this out and then start writing tests with it. Just install Pylenium and you already have that. I also liked how Cypress had their bindings. I think it's very clear and easy to read, a lot more so than Selenium. And so even though Pylenium is a wrapper of Selenium, the way that you write your tests and you write your code, it looks and feels like Selenium or like Cypress. So for example, if you're familiar with Cypress, you would say like sci.visit this, sci.get.click, right? In Pylenium, it's all Selenium under the hood, but you say py.visit, py.get, .click, right? It looks and feels like Cypress, but giving you the power and flexibility of Selenium. So it was really just meant to make it easier for myself, because I'm lazy in that way. I don't want to work on building frameworks all the time. Just install something and have it work for you. And then from there, it started catching fire because people started actually installing it and using it. And they're like, wow, I could start writing tests in minutes. And I have all these automatic waits. I have all these helpful things. It's so easy for me to write. It's just very clean. Um, so yeah, and so then I kept maintaining it and kept adding things to it. And I was like, cool, it's not just for me anymore. It's for a lot of people. So yeah.
Exactly. I think one of the things or the best things, you should have a plug and play mechanism for your framework, which will be very easy to adopt as well, right?
Yeah.
Great thought
Yeah,
process.
and it makes it, yeah, like it's just Selenium again. Like under the hood, it's Selenium. So if anything that you were familiar with before or that you want to integrate with, or you're like, I want to use this test reporting tool, like you can still do all of that, right? Like I'm not taking over everything. So if you want to use Allure or Extent or Report Portal, or go for it. I'm not going to stop you. If you're doing things, if you're doing cross-browser testing with Sauce Labs or Test Project or Lambda test or whatever, like it's easy to integrate. Like you can still do that. And so it's still very flexible because of Selenium. But the onboarding is very fast and very easy to get going with.
Right. So coming to a different topic, we have been hearing about the topic of Insprint automation. So what is your advice there? Does it actually reap benefit, and uh, how can one make this model successful of Insprint automation?
Say that question one more time, sorry.
So we have been hearing about Insprint automation. It's more like you know doing the automation even before we release the uh, product
Oh,
at the
got it.
end of the sprint, right? So, you have any advice on how we can make this model successful based on your experience? Have you ever tried something like this?
Oh, 1,000%. I don't know how to do test automation any other way. Again, like when I talked earlier before, and I was saying about like pairing and ensembling, that's, to be honest, a lot of the questions you're going to ask, I'm assuming that answer is going to answer it, where you pair and ensemble with your developers and with your team. Uh, if you want to bring testing closer to the beginning of the actual like beginning of that pipeline, or the stream, I won't say pipeline because that's overloaded, the beginning of the value stream, then you need to inject yourself in it, and you need to make it very apparent, very obvious, very visualized in why you're there. If you just say like, okay, I've been told I need to shift left, I've been told I need to do BDD, so I'm going to join this meeting and do the three amigos, and you jump in there and you don't participate, you don't engage, and you just let them do all the talking, you don't say anything, you're not being very valuable there, right? It's kind of like, why is Carlos here in the meeting if he's just hanging out? He's not saying anything. And that's why you want to do these kinds of activities like an impact mapping, like an example mapping. You want to do these kinds of activities because it gets the team to ensemble together and work on an activity that is testing related, whether it's risk analysis or that impact mapping, right? Anything like that makes it very obvious what your role is and very obvious what the value you bring is. And so my recommendation would be doing things like BDD, doing things like TDD, and adopting those. If you don't know them, you should learn them as a tester. And I'm not saying, when I say BDD or behavior driven development, I am not saying Gherkin. I'm not saying use a behavior driven library like PyTest BDD or Behave or Cucumber. No, I actually don't like those tools. I don't use those for test automation because it just adds more layers of complexity. I'm not a fan of that. But BDD as a practice, BDD as an actual like tool to use, that I like. It's a collaborative thing to do. Do those BDD things. I don't care so much about Cucumber and that stuff. Once you do that, it's easier for developers to then do TDD. You can pair with them as well. You can ensemble with them. You as a tester should not be doing the unit tests. You should be helping developers do unit tests until they get good enough at it themselves that you no longer have to do that with them. And it's just that same process. Keep pairing, keep ensembling, keep doing that. And that's how you get earlier or shift left and do things earlier on. It's then easy for you to say, if the developers are testing for this, we know the impact it's going to have. Here's what they're going to write tests for. Here's the things that they're going to consider. They need to make things testable for me so I can do this. All of that happens because of BDD and TDD. Now you can see the gaps, and then you implement the test automation around those gaps, right? They might be able to make the simple unit test for stuff, but then you go and you say, well, yes, we have the unit test for these functions, but we don't have anything that's integrating these two. We're not checking that the contract between these two services, our new one and this one, are working. So while they're doing that, I'm going to work on what is the behavior for this contract here with our stuff, and you start designing that and creating that. And now everyone is working at the same time in sprint towards the same goal.
Correct.
Right. But again, it's all about visualizing, collaborating with your team. Do not do it in isolation or you're never going to win.
So you've talked about shift left, right? In the DevOps thing, like, you also, the most trending thing is, we need to also focus on shift right. So
Mm-hmm.
what do you think on this aspect, right? How important is shift left? How important is shift right as well in the
Yeah, so
DevOps?
shift right is no longer dealing with test automation very much. So when we talk about shift right, that's now basically at deployment and at release and how things are going to be working in production, right? You're not usually doing test automation anymore the way that everyone understands test automation. Um, Otherwise, people like SRE would be calling it test automation, and they don't, right? They don't call it test automation. That's usually reserved for the left-hand side of the value stream. So when we talk about the shift right, which again, like people like shift left and shift right as terms, or they don't. But the whole point of it is at deployment, at release, and in production, how do you actually know that things are still working, right? How do you know that things are behaving they're supposed to, that they're performing like they're supposed to, that they are reliable like they're supposed to be? How do you know that? You cannot use a functional automated test to find that out. It's not good enough. Because if let's take google.com, for example. You never go to google.com and say, I hope it works today, right? No, you go to google.com and you want to search something and you search it, right? Sure. What quality attribute is that? Well, that could be a few, right? That could be it's a performance attribute because it's pretty darn fast. There's an availability attribute because it's always there, you don't worry about it. And there's a reliability attribute as well because you just know it's going to work. None of those three things you can really test with an automated test, right? It'll give you a baseline. It'll give you a snapshot. Like if you do performance test against a Google search, it'll give you a snapshot at one point in time. But what if right now, let's say at 10 a.m., we run an automated test to check the performance of google.com. You check it, you get some number. But then at 10:01 a.m., something comes down. Well, your automated test doesn't catch that because you ran it 1 minute before the outage happened. That's why traditional functional style of automated tests do not work in the shift right world. So now you have to be continually monitoring things because you need to be watching these things all of the time. And so that's why you'll hear terms like observability, terms like operability, chaos engineering, site reliability engineering. Like you'll hear these kinds of terms because this is a different style of testing now. It's a different style of quality, not the traditional functional tests that many testers are familiar with, which happen during development. So it's, in my opinion, that's more important than the left-hand side. But I don't know if you have any questions or people have questions, because I think the right side is way more important than the left side is, because the right side drives everything, including the left side. So it's most important to me. You can do a lot of testing there, a lot of experimentation there as well. And that speeds things up. Again, we're accelerating, and the right side accelerates a ton. So.
All right. Yeah. If anyone has questions, key in there. We will get them to them in some time. So, Carlos, when you're talking about test automation, at times we get, has test automation actually achieved the return on investment? So, how do we convince the management that, we have already, or how do we evaluate the true value of automation? So, there is a push behind, okay, we're doing test automation. Uh, when do we actually say that we have achieved the true value of automation in our project?
So if we go back to my definition for what the single most important thing for an automation engineer to do, which is accelerate value, right, and be able to provide insights that can be business decisions, that's your value, right? So if you're actually able to measure that acceleration, then you're already proving it, right? So when I started in automation at the beginning, my very first story, it was super obvious, right? Everyone listening is very obvious how valuable the automated script I wrote was, right? They didn't care that it was a for loop within a for loop within a for loop and that it was a really ugly Java file, right? They didn't care about that. What they cared about was the output of the automation. It went from having to pay 80 hours of work to only 4, waiting for 4. And now this was reproducible. When me and the girl were doing the manual testing before, and having to, and not even manual testing, that wasn't even manual testing, because we were just clicking generate and did it appear. That's not testing at all. We're clicking generate, right, for 80 hours. For if you do that every single day, what happened to me was I was looking at Google spreadsheet, my eyes were getting tired, I was rubbing them, like, did I run that? Did I generate that already? I'm like, oh crap, I don't remember. A bunch of human error because I'm staring at a screen clicking a button for 20 hours, right? Or 8 hours a day, right? Just going crazy clicking this button. My computer had no problem with that. My computer did the same task every single day and it took them 4 hours. Then, like, again, it didn't matter how the code looked. What management saw was it went from 80 hours to 4 hours. There's my acceleration. It was very easy to then tie money to it. How much money are they spending for those 80 hours versus how much money are they spending for the 4 hours? Of course, everyone in management was excited, right? All of us hearing this story is like, yes, that's so obvious, the value that you just did. And then from there, as I got better at programming, I reduced it even more because I learned how to do things. But it's that same thing that you want to do. You want to make it so obvious and so visualized and so easy for people to understand the value of it that they don't have to question it. The problem that we're having right now in the testing space is people are saying, how do we prove the value? They're asking that question because you don't even know yourself how to do it. Right? A lot of testers will say, I don't understand why they don't see it. How do they not understand the value of testing? Well, because you're not doing a very good job of explaining it. You're not doing a good job of visualizing or articulating it. And it's hard to hear that sometimes, but it's true, right? I haven't had a big problem of that in my career where I had to convince and beg management, please, I promise testing is good. Please, I promise test automation is good. I haven't had that problem. Why? Because it's so easy for me to visualize the value that automation provides. They all know it. The management knows it as well. What sucks is when you get this suite of tests, you want to automate it, but you don't know how long the suite took beforehand. How long did it take? How did I know that it took 80 hours before? Right? Well, I knew because me and the girl were working together and it took us a week to do it. And so we go, oh my gosh, this is taking us each 40 hours a week to do. Well, there's my baseline, 80 hours. And so any automation I do at that point makes it very easy to go, okay, well, now it's 4 hours. Well, I just saved this much time and money. So do the same thing with your automation. You're trying to accelerate things. How long does it take right now? Then after my work, it now takes this long. Well, how much time and how much money did you save from there? You've proven it just with that. So
excellent piece of advice.
yeah, and so you don't, pitfalls, again, going back to pitfalls, number of tests, terrible metric. I don't care about the number of tests. I care about how fast I'm getting to customers. If it takes 1 test to do that, cool. If it takes 0 tests to do that, that's really fast. Cool. If it takes 1,000 tests, cool. What I need to know is, why do I need that many tests? When do I need to run these tests? Who's maintaining these tests? How much time does it take to maintain these? Like, those are the kind of metrics. It's mainly time. And you're trying to accelerate that, right? So make metrics around that. That's more so what we care about in management is the work you're doing actually accelerating value, or are you just spinning your wheels and writing a bunch of tests because you don't know what else to do?
Good. So that's a nice answer. I think there's lots to learn from that. While I open up the floor for questions, I'll just have one last question for you, Carlos, from my side. Yeah, so this is one question where, where do you see the future of testing heading or test automation heading? I know you are quite done a lot of study on machine learning as well. You're fascinated by AI as well. Where do you see tools built on AI, machine learning, assisting and improving the quality lifecycle process uh, in the near future?
Yeah, so I mean, machine learning and AI are here. It's going to start happening and just get more and more prevalent as more competitors enter the space. So be ready for that. Machine learning is coming, and it's going to happen. Um, that doesn't mean that it's a scary thing. I don't know if anyone's familiar with GitHub Copilot. Um, GitHub Copilot is machine learning basically for developers. And if you've watched my stream or seen my videos on YouTube, I use Copilot, and you're actually able to see the machine learning model spit out entire functions and say, oh, this is what you're trying to do. And it just creates a function. And I just go, oh, cool. It did my job for me. Like, great. But instead of me going like, ooh, scary Copilot, it's going to take over my job as a programmer, that's not the idea of Copilot. We're not replacing developers with Copilot, just like we're not replacing testers with machine learning. The purpose of machine learning is to help make things more productive, more efficient, and augment what you're trying to do. And so if you think of the word augment, it means that it's enhancing, it's making better, right? It's not replacing, it's making better. And so embrace these tools and try them out, see what they're doing. If be a tester with it, right? Is it actually doing what it says it does? Is it something that I actually see myself using every day? Is this valuable for my team? Again, we're trying to accelerate value. Does this actually help accelerate value, or do I have to spend more time maintaining the model and training it? That doesn't sound very good for me, so I'm going to ignore machine learning for now and wait for the next cool thing to come up. So machine learning is here. It's very valuable. It's super powerful. Embrace it and just roll with it, right? So there's going to be tools that come out. I'm working on one right now for machine learning, specifically for automation engineering. It's going to help a ton, and it's going to make it so then a lot of the types of tests and or checks that we do, you don't have to do anymore. It will just do them for you. So that way you can say, okay, this is going to handle a lot of things on the left-hand side. Now I can finally focus on the shift right pieces. I can finally move into observability, and let me jump in there now. Or this is going to handle a lot of the UI automation. Fantastic. Now I can focus on doing things like the integration and the contract and the API tests. See it like that. It's meant to augment and put you in places that I think are more valuable, and keep you in that tester, holistic testing mindset, rather than it's going to replace you or anything, or you know what I mean? So it's a good thing, I promise. Give it a try, be open-minded, be a tester about it, test the crap out of it, and judge it, right? I think that's totally fine. I think as testers, we do that really well. So do that.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Carlos. So let's jump on to questions. If anyone, if you have questions, please key it in the Q&A tab and we'll take them. So the first one is more towards when you run automated regression tests, do you do it based on risk deployment or based on risk strategy?
Is it good to run automated regression based on risk? I mean, running tests based on risk. So if you know the risk, then sure. I mean, it only run the tests that you need to run, right? I think that's just smart selection of testing. But that's not the problem that interests me, right? If you and the team know the risks and you have these known knowns, yeah, cover them, right? That's what you're supposed to do. What I'm more interested in is what are the things I don't know, because those are the scarier things, right? They're either known unknowns or they're unknown unknowns. Those are the most risky things. But how do you find out the things you don't know, right? And so as a tester, you have to be thinking of those pieces as well. How do you find out the things you don't know, right? Which is an interesting problem to face, but it's one that as like at Adobe, it's big enough where like there's we go so fast that there's no way for us to think of every risk, think of every impact, think of every example early on. There's times when you just create hypotheses. You don't really know until you go to production. And so you want to wrap these features in a test, in an experiment, send it to production and monitor it there. See how customers are using it. Are they liking it? That's why things like feature toggles or A/B testing, that's why that exists. Because then you can say, I have these two ideas. I don't know which one is better though. They both solve the problem for the customer. They both solve it well, but I don't know which one the customer is going to like more. Well, then do an A/B test on that and find out. That's something you don't know, right? So how can you find out those things? And so, yes, for things that you know the risk, yes, run tests against that. And you know the risk already. Do your job as a tester there. But I'm more interested about those more harder things, the things I don't know.
Great. There's one question from Vern. How do you use techniques like BDD as a practice?
BDD as a practice, again, it's pairing and ensembling. Literally just pair with developers, pair with people on your team, other testers, and ensemble with your team. Have them go through testing activities with you. So instead of you testing the feature by yourself, what if you tested the feature with your team? What if you tested the feature with another developer? That way they could see what you're looking for. They could see what you're actually doing. And it's usually very intriguing for a developer because they don't usually know, like the way that testers do stuff is almost always a black box. And so if you open the box a bit and say, hey, let's do this together, and let me show you what I'm looking for, the developer goes, I had no idea that you were going to test that. Right? I didn't think that was an input you were going to use. The next time they're coding something, they're going to go, okay, Vern checked these things last time. Let me see if I can handle these before he gets it, right? And now you're kind of training the developer to think of these boundaries, to think of these risks and everything, just because you've educated them on the things that you're doing as well and visualized it for them. So pairing and ensembling is almost entirely the definition of BDD, but I would do that. Just work with them.
Great. There's one from Chaitanya. She says, how to decrease the automation backlog if there is no extra bandwidth assigned to you?
How to decrease the automation backlog if there's no extra bandwidth assigned to it? Let's see. I've never had an automation backlog, so let me think. It sounds as if I'm going to try to define it without knowing what it is exactly. An automation backlog, it sounds like you're trying, very traditional, you're trying to convert a bunch of manual test cases into automated test cases. And that turns into like a column, and then that's your backlog, and you bring one at a time. Am I on the right track here? Is that what an automation backlog is?
Yep, I guess so.
Okay, check that out. See, I didn't know what it was. I mean, I found out. Shoot. I've an automation backlog. How to decrease the automation backlog if there's no extra bandwidth assigned to it? I mean, I would make bandwidth to do it, right? You have to prioritize things. And so if there's something that they're like, this is important, but this is also important, I have two important things in the backlog. Well, you have to decide, right? And so if the automation backlog is not getting any bandwidth, that means that it's always lower priority. Well, then that's who's making that decision? That's their decision. And do they understand the trade-offs of that decision? So if all the manual test cases take this long to execute and you working on the automation backlog would do this to it, it would save you a bunch of time and money. And they say, but we know that, but it's still, this thing is more valuable. This thing is higher priority. Well, then they need to understand the trade-off of that. Do you understand the trade-off of that? So then you can articulate that and say, if I don't work on the automation backlog, then it's going to keep being this every single sprint. It's this. Where if you give me a sprint to work on it, I can cut it in half. Well, there's your time difference. How much time and money is that saved? And articulate that to them. And if that doesn't convince them, it's their choice, right? It's a business decision. If they don't give you the ability to be able to make that decision, that's unfortunate. I'm really sorry. I always let my testers be able to make decisions like that and say, what's the thing that you think is most valuable right now? Work on that thing. So if they're not giving you that, I'm sorry, I would move companies, but it's one of those things where do your job and articulate and visualize and make it very obvious for them to see what the trade-offs are. What are the pros of you not working on the automation? What are the cons of you not working on the automation? give them that information. If they still say that the automation stuff is lower priority, I don't know what more you can do unless you want to work overtime, and I wouldn't recommend that. So I don't know if that helps. I mean, it seems like a tough situation to be in because it sounds more like a cultural problem than an automation problem.
Uh, so there's one from Dimitri. What is your opinion in terms of a good ratio between automation and manual testing?
What is a good ratio between automation and manual testing? I would say there is no ratio because they're one and the same. They're both just testing. So you can't really do test automation without manually going through things first, right? Like I wouldn't know how to automate if I couldn't manually explore it. And so I don't like using the term manual because of that, because you can't do automation engineering without manual stuff. Like you have to do that. So it's more so just how long it takes you to turn things into code. And that's something that will be different based on each person, right? So some people, they may be really good at programming. And so that time to turn something into code, an idea or a check or an experiment or whatever, turning that into code is really fast for them. Well, good for them, right? They're really good at coding. They're going to beat you there. If you're not very good at programming, it might take you a full day to write a single test. So then you tell me how long, like how long do you think it should take you? Because there is no like ratio there. I don't want to say something like, imagine, let's throw a number out there. Imagine I say 80% automation, 20% manual. How does that help you? Like if I gave that number, how does that actually help you, right? Are you going to go to work and be like, all right, I was told 80%, so I'm going to use 6 of my hours for automation and 2 for manual. When you're doing testing, do you actually like time box yourself and say, I'm only going to work on this for 2 hours? Or do you actually give yourself freedom to holistically go through things, try to find things out that might take you 4 hours one day? One day it might be a 30-minute check. I wouldn't want to put time boxes on things because that might not be as valuable as they think it is. So again, you have to just judge, do what you think is best and work on that. If you see that automation is taking you a long time, that probably means that you're not very good at programming yet. So work on programming, get better at that if that is actually a skill set you want. If you want to just do more human-centric style testing and you don't really want to do programming, well, then you don't need to. Not every tester has to be a programmer. So that answer doesn't help them either, right? Because if I say 80-20, then they're like, well, crap, I don't know programming. Now I need to learn programming to do 80% of it. I want to be careful with answers like that. So context, man, context.
Exactly. The context of it is very important when you structure your tests. There's one more from Anis. He asks how to handle test flakiness, considering it is working fine in local, but giving different results on other servers.
How do you handle test flakiness? So I mean, when the term flaky usually means that you had an unexpected change break your code, right? That's usually what we mean by like a flaky test. So if you do something locally that works and something changed in another place, if your test fails because of that, that might be a good thing. I mean, that might be an unexpected change that's breaking your stuff. Well, awesome, right? That maybe your test actually caught the thing you wanted to catch. So, I mean, I guess it depends on how you are defining flakiness. Because if by flakiness you mean like a selector changed or something like that, or the environment is being really buggy, like locally it's faster, on dev it's really slow, then there's other considerations you have to think about. So let's say in the dev environment it's really slow. Do you need to actually run your tests there? Or can you run them in a place that's a lot more reliable? Maybe the dev environment is mainly just for different types of testing, not really for you to run your automation. So flakiness, it's an interesting subject because you want your tests to fail. You don't want them to be passing all the time or else they're not that valuable. So I think I need a little more context into like an example or something, because right now it's like, should you even be running it in that server? that the right place to put it? Should you be running it somewhere else in a more reliable place? Obviously, if your local environment is different from like the staging environment, then why are you writing tests in your local environment? Write them in the staging environment. There's so many ways I could go about this. It's a interesting question.
Correct. So just an extension to this one, you know, when you talked about object identification and scenarios, like where do you see self-healing in picture? Like some of the tools are doing self-healing. Do you think that is advantageous to eliminate flakiness?
I'm going to replace self-healing with just machine learning. I don't know if there's a lot of companies that say self-healing that aren't actually self-healing. It's just a bunch of try this. If that doesn't work, try this. If that doesn't work, try this. So with machine learning, what essentially we're trying to do is make it so then we can try to look at the application the way that a person would look at it. Maybe it's through computer vision, right? And like, how do we as humans know that if I want to get to the cart, I need to click on the cart icon? Like, we as humans, we've seen so many cart icons in our life that we assume that the cart icon is going to take us to the cart, right? And so instead of giving the test a locator that says find element by whatever cart icon, instead you can just say, you could tell the machine, I want you to click on the cart, and just say cart. Like, I want you to do this thing. And then it would try to determine what you're saying and say, you want me to click on the cart? And it's going to look at the screen and say, what on here, it gives me the best probability of getting to the cart. And it would click on that, right? So I see that as being more so what we're trying to do in machine learning, not really self-heal a test. Because if companies are doing it right, you shouldn't have to write a lot of the automation. The machine can just handle a lot of it by itself. But there's different levels. There's different levels of machine learning where test automation is at right now. There's self-healing where you still write a ton of the code. And there's some things that happen in the background. That doesn't seem as valuable to me. Because if you're doing things right, the selectors should never change. If a developer changes it, it should automatically update your test, or the developer is already writing the tests, and so they can just update their tests. You know what I mean? Like, there's so many ways to solve that problem that you don't need machine learning with, but it sounds like a whole other topic though.
Yes. So we are towards the end of the hour. So maybe the last question from my side, and for all the listeners here who have been actively listening, uh, what is the final advice that you'd give if someone wants to start into test automation? Be familiar with it and try to master it down the lane.
Number one is learn how to code. I would say learn programming. A lot of testers, and sometimes not to their own fault, they start with something like Selenium or start with something like Cypress. UI automation is really hard, y'all. Like, UI automation is not easy. It's probably one of the hardest types of automation to do. And yet testers are jump headfirst into it. It's one of the pitfalls of test automation is so many times I see frameworks that are just so poorly done that you scrap the whole project. And it's usually because it's testers leading it and they don't know how to code very well. They're just going based off of a bunch of tutorials they're learning online. And so you scrap pieces together and now you have this really ugly looking framework that is, instead of accelerating you, is actually slowing you down and you're adding more time. And that's when management gets really upset, because we invested so much time and money into this. And instead of accelerating, things are taking longer. And so that's where you hear things like testing is getting in the way of quality. So be careful with that. Be careful with that and learn how to code first, right? Take baby steps. There's a reason why people will do things like in interviews, coding challenges, right? How do you reverse a string? And they may seem really silly, but the point is I'm not interested in if someone can reverse a string. I'm interested if, do they know enough code that they can solve the problem? Because that's what we're doing in programming. You have problems and you try to solve them with code. Can you do that? Can you map things out logically? Can you design it? Can you consider the different risks that will happen here, the different scenarios, and then code that solution? So learn how to code first, understand the language you're working with. What is a package? What is a library? What is a framework? When do I use different ones? When should I use a class, or should it just be functional? That kind of thing, that's really important to learn. Get the basic fundamental understanding of programming first, and then bring on simpler types of testing. Like, for example, the easiest one would probably be unit testing, where as you're learning to code, can you write simple unit tests against the thing that you're coding, right? So if you're reversing a string, write some tests that exercise your function and say, when I use my function and I put in the word Carlos, the output should be Carlos reversed. Assert that that is true, right? It's a very simple test. So maybe start with something like unit testing first and understand that bit. That'll help you empathize with developers, by the way, because we tell them, write more unit test developers. And usually they're like, oh crap, I've never done this before in my life. And then we judge them. So that'll help you empathize with them a little bit too. But learn programming, the fundamentals first, do some unit testing. And as you get better with that, things like UI automation will become so much easier to understand rather than starting with that first, because that sounds hard to me. So
Excellent. So get your fundamentals right, everyone.
yeah.
Great piece of advice, Carlos. Thank you so much. It was great talking to you. We learned a lot of things from you here. Uh, so thank you for being there and enlightening all of us uh, on this Thursday.